Her own father bet her in a poker game, but the mafia boss who won her changed everything. Imagine a world where your own flesh and blood trades your life for a stack of plastic chips. In the dark, smoke-choked basement of a Milanese casino, a desperate gambler pushed his final chips to the center of the table, followed by a crumpled napkin bearing his only daughter's name. It was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. But the man who called that sick bet, Eduardo Serra, a ruthless mafia boss with a reputation carved in blood, wasn't looking for a slave. He was looking for leverage. This is the story of Federica, the girl who was sold into darkness, and the empire she ultimately brought to its knees. The air in the subterranean VIP room of Il Corvo was thick enough to choke a lesser man. It smelled of stale Cuban cigars, expensive cologne, and the sour, metallic tang of desperate fear. At the center of the room sat a circular mahogany table, illuminated by a single, low-hanging pendant light that cast long, sharp shadows across the faces of the men gathered around it. Marco Rossi was sweating. The droplets beaded on his forehead, catching the harsh light before rolling down his deeply lined face. He was a man who had spent his entire life chasing the phantom of a big win, a chase that had eroded his business, his marriage, and his soul. Across from him sat Eduardo Serra. Eduardo was a study in terrifying stillness. Dressed in an immaculate charcoal gray tailored suit, his dark eyes missed nothing. As the undisputed head of the Serra syndicate, he didn't play poker for the money. He played it to strip men of their masks. He watched Marco's trembling hands with a mixture of clinical detachment and profound disgust. "The bet is 500,000, Marco," Eduardo said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute silence in the room. "You are short." Marco swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the table. The other players had folded hours ago, relegated to the role of silent spectators in this execution. Marco's chips amounted to a pathetic fraction of the bet. His legitimate businesses were gone. His house was mortgaged twice over. He had nothing left to leverage. Nothing material, at least. "I need a line of credit, Eduardo. Just this once. The river card." "I know it's my card," Marco pleaded, his voice cracking. "I am not a bank, Marco. I am a businessman," Eduardo replied, leaning back slightly. "You have no collateral. Desperation is a corrosive acid. It eats away the final pillars of a man's morality." Marco's hand shook as he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a silver pen and a cocktail napkin. He scribbled furiously for a few seconds, his breath ragged. He pushed the napkin across the green felt. Eduardo did not touch it immediately. He simply looked at the erratic, desperate handwriting. It read, "Federica Rossi, 24 years old. My daughter, total guardianship and control." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Even the stoic bodyguards standing by the doors shifted uncomfortably. To wager a human life, one's own flesh and blood, was a violation of the unspoken codes that even men of violence adhered to. Eduardo's eyes flicked from the napkin to Marco's face. For a fleeting second, genuine fury flared in the boss's dark eyes, a dangerous spark that promised violence. But Eduardo was a master of his own storms. He knew Marco's debts ran deeper than this table. Marco owed money to the Russo cartel, a brutal faction involved in human trafficking. If Eduardo didn't take this bet, Marco would sell the girl to the Russos tomorrow to save his own skin. "You would bet your own blood, Marco?" Eduardo asked, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "She's smart. She works hard. She can keep your books, clean your estates, whatever you want." Marco babbled, entirely detached from the monstrous nature of his words. "Just call the bet." Eduardo slowly reached out and placed a stack of high-denomination chips over the napkin. "I call." The dealer, pale and trembling, dealt the river card. "The king of spades." Marco flipped his cards with a triumphant, hysterical laugh. "Two pair, aces and eights." Eduardo didn't blink. He calmly turned over his pocket cards, a jack and a queen of spades. Combined with the board, it was a flush. Marco's hysterical laughter died in his throat, replaced by a suffocating gasp. The color drained from his face as he stared at the cards, the reality of his total destruction crashing down upon him. Eduardo stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He picked up the napkin, folding it neatly, and placed it in his pocket. He looked down at the broken man, weeping openly at the table. "Collect your coats, gentlemen," Eduardo commanded his men. He cast one final, icy glance at Marco. "Matteo will collect my winnings in the morning. And Marco, if you are in Milan by tomorrow night, you will be in the river." Federica Serra, though she still carried the name Rossi at the time, woke up to the sound of rain lashing against the thin window pane of her cramped apartment. She was 24, a recent accounting graduate who worked 3 jobs to keep the electricity on and to silently cover the smaller debts her father left in his destructive wake. She was beautiful, with sharp, intelligent features and dark, resilient eyes, but exhaustion had painted faint purple shadows beneath them. She was in the kitchen, brewing cheap coffee, when the heavy, rhythmic knocking began. It wasn't the impatient rap of a landlord, it was the measured, authoritative knock of a problem. She opened the door to find her father, Marco, standing in the hallway, looking like a corpse that had forgotten to lie down. Behind him stood a man built like a concrete wall, wearing a tailored black overcoat. This was Matteo. "Papa, what's going on?" Federica asked, her chest tightening. Marco pushed past her, incapable of meeting her gaze. He collapsed onto the worn sofa, burying his face in his hands. "I'm sorry, Fede. I'm so sorry. I had no choice." Federica turned to the giant in the doorway. "Who are you? What does he owe you?" She reached for her worn purse. "I have 2,000 saved. It's yours. Just leave him alone." Matteo looked at her, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of pity crossed his eyes. "He doesn't owe money anymore, Miss Rossi. The debt was settled last night." "Settled? How?" Federica demanded, the icy fingers of dread curling around her stomach. Marco sobbed, a pathetic, wet sound. "I played a hand, Fede. The biggest game. I needed collateral. I thought I had the winning hand. I swear to God, I thought I had it." The truth hit Federica with the force of a physical blow. The breath left her lungs. She stared at the man who had raised her, the man she had sacrificed her youth to protect, and realized he had traded her away like a used car. You bet me?" Her voice was barely a whisper, devoid of tears. The shock was too absolute, too profound for crying. "It's to Eduardo Serra," Marco pleaded, reaching out for her hand, which she immediately snatched away as if he were venomous. "He's a businessman. He'll just have you do paperwork. If I didn't do it, the Russos would have killed me, Fede." Federica stood frozen, her mind racing. She knew the name Eduardo Serra. Everyone in Milan knew that name. He was the shadow that governed the city's underworld. "Pack a bag, Miss Rossi," Matteo said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "The boss is waiting." Federica didn't scream. She didn't break down. A cold, hardened armor began to form over her heart in that exact moment. The father she loved died on that sofa. The man sitting there was merely a ghost she no longer recognized. She walked into her bedroom, packed a single duffel bag with her clothes and her accounting textbooks, and walked back out. She walked past Marco without a single glance downward. The ride to Lake Como was executed in absolute silence. Federica stared out the tinted window of the armored SUV, watching the dreary city streets give way to the sprawling, majestic landscapes of the Italian countryside. She was preparing herself for a dungeon, for violence, for the absolute loss of her dignity. When the heavy iron gates of the Serra estate parted, revealing a breathtaking 18th century villa surrounded by manicured gardens and armed guards, Federica took a deep breath. She made a silent vow to herself. "I will not be broken. I will learn this cage, and I will survive it." She was escorted into a massive, sunlit library that smelled of old paper and leather. Standing by the window, looking out over the gray waters of the lake, was Eduardo Serra. He turned as she entered. Federica braced herself, lifting her chin, refusing to show the terror vibrating in her bones. Eduardo studied her. He saw the defiance, the intelligence, and the distinct lack of tears. He walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. "Federica," he said softly, "am I to be locked in a room, Signor Sarah? Or should I start cleaning the floors now?" she asked, her voice steady, sharp as broken glass. Eduardo frowned slightly. "You are not a maid, and this is not a prison. Sit down." She hesitated, then sat in a high-backed leather chair. Eduardo sat across from her, placing a thick file on the table between them. "Your father is a parasite," Eduardo began, his tone strictly business. "Last night, he tried to bet you in a poker game. What he didn't tell you, because he is a coward, is that he had already promised you to Lorenzo Russo. The Russos deal in human trafficking. If I hadn't taken his bet, you would be on a cargo ship to Eastern Europe by midnight tonight." Federica felt the room spin, but she gripped the armrests to anchor herself. "I took the bet to pull you out of Russo's reach," Eduardo continued. "But I do not run a charity. You are here because you represent a €2 million loss to my syndicate. Your file says you have a degree in forensic accounting." "I do," Federica whispered, finding her voice. "Good. My legitimate enterprises require an audit. You will live here, under my protection. You will work in my study. You will find the leaks in my businesses. When you have saved me €2 million, you are free to walk out those gates." Federica stared at the mafia boss. He wasn't a monster slavering for her demise. He was a kingmaker offering her a twisted sort of salvation. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "Then I will drive you back to Milan myself. And you can take your chances with your father and the Russos," Eduardo said simply. Federica looked at the file, then back at Eduardo's dark, unyielding eyes. "Where do I start?" Life at the Villa Serra was a paradox. It was a prison of unimaginable luxury. Federica was given a sprawling suite with a balcony overlooking the lake, a wardrobe filled with clothes tailored to her measurements, and total freedom to roam the estate, provided she was accompanied by a discreet guard. But the perimeter was absolute. The stone walls and the men carrying concealed weapons were a constant reminder that she was property, collateral for a coward's debt. Yet, Eduardo Serra never treated her as such. Weeks turned into a month. Federica spent 12 hours a day in the estate's massive archives, drowning herself in the ledgers of Eduardo's legitimate fronts, real estate holding companies, international shipping logistics, and a chain of high-end boutique hotels. She used the work as a shield, a way to keep her mind off the crushing betrayal of her past life. She expected Eduardo to be a tyrant, barking orders and demanding compliance. Instead, she found him to be a phantom of discipline. He worked as hard as she did, often joining her in the library late at night. They would sit in silence for hours, the only sounds the scratching of pens, the turning of pages, and the crackle of the fireplace. One stormy Tuesday evening, Federica was cross-referencing a series of shell companies tied to the shipping division. She noticed a pattern, a subtle, brilliant skimming operation hidden beneath inflated fuel costs and ghost invoices. It wasn't a simple accounting error. It was deliberate sabotage. Eduardo walked in, pouring 2 glasses of scotch. He placed one near her elbow without a word. "You look like you found a ghost, Federica," he noted, taking a seat opposite her. "Not a ghost," she replied, turning the ledger toward him. "A parasite. Look at the fuel expenditures for the Genoese ports over the last 4 quarters. They spike precisely 3 days before your major cargo shipments. But the tonnage doesn't justify the burn rate. Someone is redirecting the funds into offshore accounts disguised as maintenance vendors." Eduardo leaned in, his eyes scanning the numbers. His jaw tightened. Federica watched his reaction closely. The raw intellect of the man was undeniable. He didn't need her to explain the math twice. He saw the narrative in the numbers instantly. "How much?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Roughly €4 million over the past 18 months, Federica stated. "It's someone high up. Someone with clearance to authorize autonomous payouts. It's signed off by a man named Silvio. Silvio was one of Eduardo's most trusted capos, a man who had served his father before him." Eduardo closed his eyes for a brief second, the betrayal registering on his face. mirroring the exact expression Federica had worn the morning her father sold her. "You are sure of this?" Eduardo asked, looking up at her. For the first time, the impenetrable wall between them seemed to crack. He wasn't looking at her as collateral. He was looking at her as an equal. "Numbers don't lie, Señor Serra. Only people do," she replied softly. Eduardo stood up, picking up his glass. He walked to the window, watching the rain batter the glass. "When I was 19, he began, his voice barely audible over the storm. "My father owed a debt to a rival family. He didn't have the cash. So, he offered my older sister, Elena." Federica froze, the breath catching in her throat. The parallel was horrifying. "I tried to stop it," Eduardo continued, his knuckles turning white around the glass. "I was beaten half to death and locked in a cellar. By the time I got out, Elena was gone. I found her 3 years later in a brothel in Naples. She was broken beyond repair. She took her own life 2 days after I brought her home." He turned back to Federica, his eyes burning with a dark, haunted intensity. "I took over the family the next day. I instituted a new rule. We deal in vice, we deal in violence, but we never trade in human flesh. And we never, ever betray our own blood." He walked back to the table, leaning down so he was eye level with her. "Your father disgusts me because he is the ghost of my father. I brought you here to save you, yes, but I also brought you here because I wanted to prove to myself that a daughter doesn't have to be destroyed by the sins of her father. You have saved my syndicate 4 million euros tonight, Federica. Your debt is paid in full." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the crumpled cocktail napkin from that fateful poker game, and set it on fire with a silver lighter. He dropped it into an ashtray, letting it burn to ash. "Tomorrow morning, a car will take you wherever you want to go in the world. You are free." Federica stared at the ashes. For weeks, she had dreamed of this exact moment. She had fantasized about walking out the gates and never looking back. But as she looked at Eduardo, a man painted as a monster by society, yet the only man who had ever truly protected her, she realized the world outside these walls was far more terrifying. "What are you going to do about Silvio?" she asked, not moving from her chair. Eduardo's eyes narrowed. "I am going to cut out the rot. Silvio knows the books better than you do," Federica said, leaning forward. "He's hidden the money well. You need someone to trace the offshore accounts, to repatriate the funds before he realizes you're onto him. You need me. You are free, Federica. Do not tie yourself to a sinking ship." "I've spent my whole life tied to a sinking ship," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet, fierce power. "My father was a coward who let the water in. You are fighting to keep the ship afloat. I want to stay." Eduardo stared at her for a long, silent moment. The dynamic shifted entirely. She was no longer a captive. She was a partner. "Then we have a lot of work to do," Eduardo said. The following weeks fundamentally changed the power structure within the Serra Syndicate. Federica did not leave. Instead, she moved her base of operations from the quiet library to the tactical war room alongside Eduardo. She was no longer the girl from the poker game. She was the architect of Eduardo's financial retribution. Under Eduardo's protection, Federica blossomed. The timid, exhausted girl from the Milan apartment was gone, replaced by a formidable woman who commanded respect. She wore tailored power suits, her demeanor as sharp and unforgiving as the numbers she manipulated. They worked seamlessly together to dismantle Silvio's embezzlement ring. Federica traced the stolen funds through a labyrinth of shell corporations in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, legally outmaneuvering Silvio's bankers and freezing the assets before Silvio even knew he was a target. The proximity between Federica and Eduardo bred an intense, unspoken bond. It wasn't the fiery, chaotic passion of a cheap romance. It was a deep, resonating respect forged in the fires of mutual trauma and shared ambition. Eduardo found himself seeking her counsel not just on finances, but on strategy. Federica found in Eduardo a man of unyielding principle, a stark contrast to the spineless nature of her own father. But the peace was an illusion. Silvio, realizing his accounts were frozen and his betrayal exposed, did not flee. He was a cornered rat, and cornered rats bite. Knowing he couldn't take on Eduardo's loyalists alone, Silvio made a pact with the devil, Lorenzo Russo. The Russos had been waiting for an opportunity to strike at the Serra Empire. Silvio offered them the layout of the Lake Como estate, the guard rotations, and a prize that Lorenzo Russo still felt belonged to him, Federica Rossi. The attack came on a moonless Thursday night. Federica was in the war room, reviewing a final set of transfers, when the power to the entire estate was abruptly cut. The sprawling villa plunged into pitch blackness. A second later, the heavy, deafening roar of automatic gunfire shattered the tranquility of the lake. The shattering of glass and the shouts of men echoed through the grand halls. Eduardo burst into the room, a suppressed, tactical pistol in his hand, a flashlight mounted to the barrel cutting through the dark. "Stay low. Move," he barked, grabbing her arm and pulling her behind the massive oak conference table, just as the wall of windows exploded inward, showered by a hail of bullets. "What is happening?" Federica yelled over the deafening noise, adrenaline flooding her veins. "Silvio sold us out to the Russos. They've breached the south gate," Eduardo said grimly, checking his magazine. He looked at her, his expression fierce. "They are here for me, and they are here for you." Federica didn't panic. The weeping, helpless girl Marco had relied upon was dead. She crawled toward the emergency tactical panel hidden beneath the desk, a system Eduardo had shown her weeks ago. She blindly felt for the heavy steel lever that engaged the estate's interior lockdown protocols. She pulled it. Heavy steel shutters violently slammed down over the remaining windows, and thick blast doors sealed the corridors, effectively trapping the intruders in the outer wings of the villa while fortifying the inner sanctum. Red emergency lights bathed the room in a bloody glow. "They're locked in the west wing," Federica said, her breathing heavy but controlled. Eduardo looked at her, a profound mixture of awe and pride in his eyes. "You learn fast." "I had a good teacher," she replied, but the victory was short-lived. A massive explosion rocked the floorboards. The Russos had brought breaching charges. The blast door down the hall groaned, buckling under the explosive force. "They're coming through," Eduardo said, stepping out from behind the desk, positioning himself between Federica and the door. "If I fall, you take my gun. You do not let them take you alive, Federica. Do you understand?" "We are not dying tonight, Eduardo," she said fiercely. The mangled steel door gave way, and armed men flooded the corridor. Eduardo moved with terrifying precision, dropping the first 3 men with clean, calculated shots. But there were too many. A bullet grazed Eduardo's shoulder, spinning him backward. He hit the ground hard, his weapon sliding across the polished floor. A massive Russo enforcer stepped into the room, raising a shotgun, aiming down at Eduardo. Time seemed to slow. Federica didn't think. She reacted. She lunged across the floor, grabbing a heavy brass sculpture from a side table and hurled it with all her might. The heavy brass struck the enforcer squarely in the temple, just as he pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast went wide, blowing a hole in the ceiling. Before the man could recover, Matteo and a squad of Serra loyalists, who had fought their way up from the barracks, flanked the hallway, opening fire and neutralizing the remaining attackers. Silence fell over the villa, save for the ringing in their ears and the smell of cordite. Federica scrambled to Eduardo's side, pressing her hands against the bleeding wound on his shoulder. He looked up at her, wincing through the pain, but a small, genuine smile touched his lips. "I told you to take the gun, not the sculpture. I improvise," she whispered, her hands trembling as the adrenaline began to crash. The aftermath of the assault was swift and brutal. By morning, the Russo hit squad had been entirely eradicated. Silvio was found hiding in a boathouse. His fate was sealed behind closed doors, and his name was never spoken again. Lorenzo Russo, realizing his decapitation strike had failed, retreated into hiding, his cartel severely weakened by the loss of his best men. Eduardo's wound was stitched up by the syndicate's private physician. He was battered, but alive. 2 days later, as the estate was being repaired, Matteo approached Federica in the gardens. "Miss Rossi, there is someone at the front gate. He is demanding to see you." Federica's blood ran cold. She didn't need to ask who it was. She walked to the massive iron gates, accompanied by Matteo and 2 armed guards. Standing on the other side, looking smaller, more pathetic, and infinitely more desperate than the last time she saw him, was her father, Marco. When Marco saw her, he gripped the iron bars. "Fede! Oh, thank God, I heard about the attack." The Russos told me he stopped, realizing his slip-up. Federica's eyes hardened into chips of obsidian. "The Russos told you? You knew they were coming." I made a deal, Fede," Marco stammered, tears streaming down his face. "Lorenzo said if I gave them the layout of the estate, they would wipe out Eduardo and give you back to me. I did it for us. We can go back to Milan." The absolute moral bankruptcy of the man was staggering. He had conspired to murder the man who saved her, just to reclaim her and likely sell her again. "Give me back to you?" Federica's voice was deathly quiet, carrying clearly through the iron bars. "I am not a watch you pawned, Marco. I am a human being you discarded." "I'm your father," he screamed, rattling the gates. "You owe me." Eduardo stepped out from the shadows of the guardhouse, his arm in a sling, his presence instantly suffocating Marco's outburst. Marco shrank back, terrified. "Open the gate," Federica commanded Matteo. Matteo hesitated, looking at Eduardo. Eduardo nodded slightly. The heavy gates buzzed and swung open. Federica stepped out, standing face to face with the man who had ruined her early life. She didn't strike him. She didn't yell. She simply looked at him with an absolute, chilling indifference. "You are nothing to me," Federica said, her words slicing through the morning air like a scalpel. "You are not my father. You are a weak, pathetic parasite who feeds on everyone around you. Eduardo Serra is a man who deals in darkness, but he possesses 10 times the honor you will ever have." Marco fell to his knees, sobbing, reaching for the hem of her coat. "Please, Fede, I have no money. The Russos will kill me for failing." Federica took a step back, out of his reach. "Then you had better start running." She turned her back on him and walked back through the gates. "Close them," she ordered. As the heavy iron clanged shut, severing her completely and permanently from her past, Federica felt a massive, suffocating weight lift from her chest. The ghost of Marco Rossi would never haunt her again. She walked back up the driveway, Eduardo falling into step beside her. "That was hard," he noted quietly. "It was necessary," she replied, staring straight ahead. "A tree cannot grow if the roots are rotting." Months passed. The seasons changed, painting the shores of Lake Como in brilliant hues of autumn gold and crimson. The Serra Syndicate had undergone a radical transformation. With Federica's financial genius and Eduardo's strategic ruthlessness, they had purged the organization of its most toxic elements. The human trafficking rings run by rival families were dismantled, not by violence, but by Federica systematically destroying their financial infrastructures, starving them out of existence. The Serra family transitioned heavily into legitimate global logistics and real estate, using their intimidating reputation to enforce clean, unbreakable contracts. Federica was no longer Rossi. She had legally changed her name to Federica Serra, not through marriage, but through a formal, unbreakable adoption into the inner circle, an unprecedented move in the patriarchal world of the Italian mafia. She was the consigliere, the untouchable queen of the syndicate's wealth. One evening, a grand gala was held at the villa to celebrate the acquisition of a major shipping port in Genoa, a completely legitimate, multi-million euro triumph. The ballroom was filled with politicians, business moguls, and the new, refined breed of syndicate lieutenants. Federica stood on the grand staircase, looking out over the empire she had helped build. She wore a stunning emerald gown, radiating power, confidence, and unshakable dignity. Eduardo approached her, handing her a glass of champagne. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound, unspoken emotion. It wasn't the possessive gaze of a captor. It was the reverent look of a man looking at his equal. "You look beautiful tonight, Federica," he said, touching his glass to hers. "We built something incredible, Eduardo," she replied, taking a sip. "You built it," he corrected gently. I just provided the foundation. When you came here, you were a girl traded for chips. Look at you now. You hold the city in your hands. I learned that true power isn't about controlling others, Federica said, looking into his dark eyes. It's about having absolute control over yourself. They tried to make me a victim, a piece of collateral. But you can only be a victim if you surrender your dignity. Eduardo smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened the hard lines of his face. To resilience, he toasted. To truth, she countered, clinking her glass against his. As the orchestra began to play, Eduardo offered her his hand. Federica took it, stepping onto the dance floor. They moved in perfect synchronization. Two people who had been forged in trauma and fire, emerging stronger, unbreakable, and fiercely loyal to one another. The girl who was bet in a poker game had not just survived, she had rewritten the rules of the game entirely. She had faced the deepest moral injustice and transformed it into a legacy of power, redemption, and unyielding self-worth.